and welcome to the latest session of our online Bible study. This is session 11, and together we're going to read Luke 18. It's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. We'll learn in this session that while obedience to the law is commendable, it can set us up for a fall into a dangerous trap. It can lead us to foolish boasting by us about our personal standing with God. It can cause us to forget our own failings. It can cause us to conveniently ignore that we all fall far short of God's standard and God's hope for each one of us. We were reminded in the last study about the danger of comparing ourselves to others. And in this study, we will revisit that. And we'll revisit the dangers of trying to justify our current state by pointing the finger at others, which only leads to false hope and a false sense of confidence, which diminishes the work of Jesus in our lives. We will see all this play out in this session as Jesus addresses two types of people. So keep in mind, what was Jesus intending to teach? And what warnings does Jesus give? I hope you find this session useful and helpful.
This session's parable is incredibly challenging, and yet it's very short. Let's start by reading the parable.
To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted.
I find it very helpful when looking at these parables to keep in mind that they were stories that deliberately paralleled messages that Jesus was trying to communicate. And these messages were told in a way that helped the people of that day to understand them. So to make sure that I learn as much as possible from these messages, I need to put myself in their shoes, or maybe their sandals, so that I get the most learning and the parables come to life. As well as the individual learning I am getting from these parables, I don't think that I will ever forget the Cara Project's model for reading about Jesus. I can almost recite it off by heart. Who is the original audience? What would the original hearer know that I miss? Who are the characters? How are they described? Does the parable have an unexpected ending? How would Jesus tell the parable today? And as we listen to the video from the Cara Project, some words to keep in mind. Righteousness, justification, sin, repentance, and mercy.
Hi friends, Heather Erickson here with the Cara Project. Today we're studying the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, which we find in Luke 18, verses 9 through 14. As we dive into this parable, the first thing we always love to do when we study a parable is figure out who Jesus is talking to. So we read it right in verse 9, and if you dive in with me and read it together with me today, it says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, this is the parable that Jesus told them. And I was like, okay, so it's likely Pharisees, religious leaders, which we'll get to in a second of who they are if you're not familiar with that term. But I was like, this also could be describing me. I can get confident sometime, and I can also look down at other people. So I'm like, okay, all right, Lord, I'm listening as we dive in here. So we have two people that Jesus talks about in our parable, the Pharisee and the tax collector. And they're headed to the temple to pray. The Pharisee, if we know anything about Jewish religious leaders at all, that's what the Pharisee was. Back at the beginning of the Bible, when we look at Moses getting the law from God descended and said, hey, in order for you to have right standing with me, these are all the things you have to do in order to have right standing. And God was kind of giving the long list on purpose to be able to say, there's nothing you can do. You can't actually be perfect enough to be able to get right standing. And that's why he's going to have to send Jesus. He sends Jesus later in the Bible, so that we see that the reason why Jesus came was to abolish the law and have to get rid of it all, because we don't have to do all these things. That's not what God expects of us. But he gave these laws to kind of show there's nothing we can do. So 613 laws later, the Pharisees are all trying to keep the laws and make sure that everybody knows how to pray and what to eat and how to preserve sanctification and make sure they're worthy for God. But they started adding rules on top of it. It's like when you tell your kids, hey, you're not allowed to go outside, but instead you say, yeah, you actually can't leave your room, because you're trying to add in different buffers and different rules to make sure that they don't break the real rule. Same concept for the Pharisees. They started adding in additional rules. Now, in the heart of it, they were trying to be God-honoring, but they twisted it to become more about what they did and making sure that they were seen for how well they kept the law, and it started to get tainted. And that's what we see a little bit in today's parable. We see some of the taintedness, which we'll get to. The second person in our story is a tax collector. In that time, in the Roman rule, tax collectors would take on the taxes and accept them from the people so they could pay Rome. Now, if you were a Jewish tax collector in that time period, that would mean that you have turned your back from your Jewish family to be able to go and work for Rome. But in addition to that, as a tax collector, you could add on additional fees to the taxes you were collecting and pocket them for yourself, and Rome would be fine with it. As long as they got their money, they're good with whatever you did. So these tax collectors became greedy and dishonest. They became known as at the level of prostitute and sinner, like that level of scum in the world. So now we enter into our parable, where Jesus is describing to these people coming to the temple to pray. And I'm just going to read it for you because it's so good. So 2 men went to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. I'm reading out of an NIV Bible, by the way. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He couldn't even get close to the temple. Stood at a distance. He wouldn't even look up to heaven, and he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So Jesus not only can you, as you understand what a tax collector is and a Pharisee, you can see this embodied in who they are and how they talk and the way that Jesus describes them. And Jesus says at the end, I tell you that this man, the tax collector man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all of those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humbled themselves will be exalted. How powerful. Here we have the tax collector leaving justified. And yet the Pharisee spends his time talking about, not only am I not like these guys, but look at all this stuff I did. Like, if you are standing in front of God and you get to say, I'm not that guy, I'm not that guy, I'm not that guy, and I did all these amazing things, did you see my checklist? And God's like, that doesn't matter to me. It's the purpose and the posture of your heart that matters to me. And if you're willing to humbly acknowledge the sin in your life and bring it to God, that's what he cares about. And that's what makes this parable so powerful. Because it not only is speaking to the people listening to Jesus in the original audience, it speaks directly to us. It speaks directly to me. I find myself easily wanting to have more confidence in who I am by myself rather than who I am through God. And if I would humble myself and know that I am nothing without God, it totally changes the perspective. And I hope that this parable was as encouraging to you as it was to me. I hope you have a great day. God bless.
We know that Jesus told parables to make a point. So for us to best understand the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, let's make sure we understand who he was talking to. Don't you think it's interesting that in this parable, Jesus doesn't just talk about the Pharisees? And the reason for that is because at this point, he's actually speaking directly to the Pharisees. At this point in history, Pharisees were seen as the religious elite. They were looked up to. They were admired. Their ministry at the time of Jesus was focused on and was in response to concerns about a decline in religion at that time and a wavering from the laws that God had given. The Jews were having their own problems with church attendance in the time of Jesus, a bit like the world today. In the Old Testament, there were 613 commands given to Moses from God to pass on to the Jewish people. These laws governed everything from what to wear, how to pray, what to eat, how to preserve holiness, and how to live both inside and outside of the temple. But people were regularly failing to keep these laws, and the Pharisees, who were the experts of the law, were policing strict observance of them all. And this was seen as important, not negative. And whilst our children's flannel graphs these days try to depict the Pharisees as nasty men in black, they were actually, in the time of Jesus, highly acclaimed and very well thought of. They saw their ability to keep the law as a measure of their righteousness before God. But unfortunately, the Pharisees added their own interpretations of the law. They allowed their human side to overtake the spiritual drive within them. Listen to what it says in Matthew 23 verse 4. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Quite thought-provoking, isn't it? But let's not forget, the Pharisees' original intentions were God-honouring. But they became so involved in perfectly keeping the law that they forgot that the law was designed to teach them of their need for a saviour. Yes, they were moral, but they also became immensely proud and received the harshest rebuke from Jesus. Listen to what he says in Matthew 23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. What an insult. And in Hosea 6:6 we read, I am better pleased with true goodness than with the most exact observance of the external duties of religion. That flies in the face of everything the Pharisees believed was right. Jesus was concerned that these holy people were making the law more important than God himself. We can learn so much from Jesus and his rebuke of the Pharisees. The lesson I'm taking from this personally is that it's not just the Pharisees who need to stay focused on Christ's work. We too need to focus on him instead of our own achievements for him.
found that really helpful, Graham. It's so easy to forget that the Pharisees believed that they were dedicated men of God. And they won't be the only Christian leaders to lose their way. And now we're going to look at the other character in the parable, the tax collector. At that time the Jews were under Roman rule, and Jewish tax collectors would pay a small fee to the Roman government for the privilege to collect taxes. Any extra taxes that they collected, they were free to keep for themselves. And this led many tax collectors to increase charges to gain more money and even target those who could not pay quickly so that they could also charge interest. As a result, tax collectors were despised by their own people. They were considered greedy, dishonest, traitors, and as Heather said on the video, they were considered as bad as prostitutes. The tax collector's social status could not get much lower. And yet, surprisingly, these were the types of people whom Jesus sought to spend his time with, which attracted harsh criticism from the Pharisees. Even though even the tax collectors themselves felt unworthy of going into the temple to pray, Jesus loved them and desired them to be part of his family.
This study has really helped me to know the Pharisees and the tax collectors a whole lot better. The righteous and the unrighteous. You'd be hard pressed to meet two groups of people more different from each other. And it gets even more interesting when we explore how each prays, because I can tell you their prayers were vastly different. The Pharisee, well, he stood looking up to God, thanking him that he was not like other men. How arrogant is that? He boasted of his good deeds, how often he fasted, how much he tithed. He couldn't stop finding good things to talk about himself. He genuinely believed that because of his good works, his salvation was secure. Truly, though, he forgot where his security came from. And then on the other hand, we've got the tax collector. He kept far off from the crowd and could not bring himself to even lift his eyes, never mind his face, towards heaven. And he said, God be merciful on me, a sinner. Unlike the Pharisees, the tax collector knew of his sins and his unworthiness, and he begged God for mercy. He knew he had no right to claim God's love and throw himself on God's mercy, yet he still did. I found myself thinking, which do I relate to? It's interesting that up to this point in the story that the Pharisees to whom Jesus was speaking were likely nodding in agreement with him, as they thought he was giving those tax collectors a really good rollicking. They could agree with Jesus on something, finally. But once again, this parable had a twist in the tail, and Jesus was about to throw them a curveball. Listen to Luke 18:14 from the Message Bible. This tax man, not the other, went home made right with God. If you walk around with your nose in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to be simply yourself, you will become more than yourself. Isn't that a really interesting translation? The Pharisees must have been stunned by this part of the story. Both had prayed. Both had looked to God for him to sort out their problems. But only the unlikely tax collector left the temple justified. He recognized his own sin and unrighteousness and turned to God and God alone for his forgiveness.
By telling the Pharisees the parable, Jesus was showing them that although they were religious and that they kept all the laws and were generally good people, they lacked an understanding of God's standard for righteousness. Thankfully, for you and for me, God does not justify one person over another based on their obedience to the law. And we should also note that, try as he might, the Pharisee could never achieve absolute perfection. Listen to what Galatians chapter 2 and verses 15 and 16 has to say.
We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. As for those who seem to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not judge by external appearance. Those men added nothing to my message.
Where the Pharisees went wrong was that they lost sight of what justified really meant. It was right that God's people were expected to follow his law. But following the law was meant to mirror our need for Jesus, because God knew that we would always slip up along the way, and as hard as we try, we are incapable of keeping the entire law. Don't forget that God gave Moses 613 laws. If man could keep every single law, be sinless before God by his own merit and good works, there would be absolutely no need for a saviour. But in God's grand design, he knew of our fallen state and inability to save ourselves. This is why Jesus was sent on our behalf, to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. When the Father looks on us, he doesn't see our sin. He sees Christ's right standing that has been attributed to us, which cannot be lost. Like the tax collector, we need to acknowledge our sin and our unworthiness and bring it before God. He will be merciful to us. He will set us free and do what the law could not do.
As I think about to